Welcome. I'm Andrew Thomas. So, in this talk, I want to give a broad overview of some of the features as well as conceptual issues associated with the Bozeman UDC. This talk is intended, again, as a conceptual overview. I understand that there are numerous details in many of the topics that I will be speaking about that could elicit further discussion and more extensive understanding. What I will say to this is I can be reached via this email, businesslawpolicyanalysis@gmail.com. If you have questions or comments, I am more than happy to entertain any discussion regarding anything that I discussed today. So, first off, to give a little bit of an introduction and idea of my background, I am an academic. I have lived in Montana now for 9 years. I've lived in the Northwest for the better part of 30 years, off and on. My background is, again, predominantly as an academic, but I am also an attorney who's practiced in areas of property law and a land use and policy consultant. My master's and PhD is in political science, emphasizing areas of public policy administration and political behavior. I also have a law degree and a master's degree and doctorate in accounting and finance. Got all of those degrees so that you don't have to. So hopefully I can share some of my understanding and background with you today in this talk to help you understand this very important issue. And again, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments. So the Bozeman UDC proposes both general as well as specific goals and standards governing development in Bozeman's incorporated area. It also integrates with both countywide as well as statewide planning goals. This talk will be divided into a couple of sections, and they're somewhat independent, but they're also somewhat related. The first section that I'd like to discuss is goals. So goals represent the conceptual premises from which specific policies are derived. And as we will see, the specific policies promulgated in the plan definitely relate to these goals. Also, when we consider the goals broadly, they speak volumes to many of the critiques as well as agendas that are implicit in the UDC plan. So this is taken directly from the UDC, and I'm just going to briefly review and comment on some of these goals and then give a little bit further analysis. So one of the goals of the UDC is promoting neighborhoods that are self-sustaining and will lay the foundation for healthy lifestyles. So right off the bat, we have an issue with ambiguity. What exactly is self-sustaining? Montana as a whole is not a self-sustaining state, for example. If you were to cut Montana off from the national, let alone global economy, we'd be in trouble pretty quickly. A single neighborhood in Bozeman cannot be self-sustaining. If it were, the standard of living would be pretty primitive. Also, what is a healthy lifestyle? Implicitly in this statement is the idea that people should be walking, using their cars less, out of a feature of urban design. Another goal is to support compact, walkable developments that promote balanced transportation options. Necessarily, this means that the UDC assumes that public transit, pedestrian, and bicycle traffic will be a much more substantial portion of transportation than it currently is and realistically can become. Promote a range of housing options, single, two, three, and four dwelling units, townhouses, row houses, and multi-unit dwellings. Okay, nothing wrong with that. Different people desire different types of housing. Each has distinct advantages and disadvantages. However, what this really means is they're promoting more multifamily housing and especially dense multifamily housing over single family housing. And this goes directly against one, what most people prefer, but also against what is practically feasible. Provide for a diverse array of commercial and civic uses supporting residential development. Also, have residential and commercial uses mixed vertically and horizontally. Again, is this something that is feasible or desirable for most people? Mixed use development is a feature of new urbanism, an idea promoted by a land use commentator by the name of Jane Jacobs. It is not something that most people would prefer to live in. Locate commercial uses within walking distance of residential spaces. So again, question here is this feasible for everything? It's one thing to have a bar or restaurant within walking distance of your house. It is another thing to assume that people are going to carry their groceries or whatever they buy at Walmart from the shopping area to where they live. Locate commercial, or next one is encourage developments that exhibit the physical and design characteristics of vibrant urban and pedestrian-orientated complete streets. Vibrant is a term that is used by density advocates and planners ubiquitously. However, in the 20 or so years I've been studying this topic, I still not yet figured out what exactly vibrant is. Seems like they're trying to dictate culture and they can't even measure what exactly they're dictating. More on that in a little bit. Some more goals: providing standards that emphasize a sense of place. What is a sense of place? Much like vibrancy, it's a very arbitrary concept. Seems more like a marketing gimmick or a brand than robust, unambiguous public policy related to infrastructure. Enhancing an existing neighborhood's sense of place and strive to make it more self-sustainable. Again, more fluff words that really cannot be translated into tangible or unambiguous action. Now, that isn't to say that communities don't have a right to determine the character of their neighborhood or influence it. However, it has to be understood that that is an organic feature of a place developing on its own, and it cannot really be dictated by government policy. Encouraging new neighborhood commercial centers with a unique identity and a strong sense of place. Again, fluff. Developing commercial and mixed-use areas that are safe, comfortable, and attractive to pedestrians. All right, that may be attractive. However, realistically, what proportion of commercial as well as residential spaces are going to be like that? Reinforcing the principle of streets as public places that encourage pedestrian and bicycle travel, transit, on-street parking, and physical elements of complete streets. No mention of the primary mode of transit, which is the car, and ensuring that traffic flows efficiently and smoothly. In fact, when you look at a lot of planning literature, there is this concept that is frequently discussed relative to promoting public transit, which is the idea of induced demand. Therefore, if we make congestion worse, people will walk, ride their bikes, or take buses. Again, not very rational public policy. Some more goals: creating, where appropriate, centers within existing neighborhoods. Centers for what? The idea that, for example, every neighborhood needs a grocery store that's likely quite expensive to be within walking distance of the community is questionable. There's a reason why big box retailers such as Walmart or Winco or Home Depot developed, because people generally, when they buy stuff from those places, buy in bulk at lower prices and they can transport it with their cars. Facilitating proven market-driven projects to ensure both long-term and short-term financial viability. This is a little bit of a lie. In fact, it's a very big lie. The type of development that is promoted in the UDC, if you look at communities that have adopted it, so one example is Portland, Oregon, results in much, much more expensive building types, much higher infrastructure costs, also much less desirable commercial as well as residential spaces, and ultimately impinges upon the financial viability as well as social and environmental viability of the community. Allowing for an appropriate blend of complementary land uses, including but not limited to retail, offices, commercial services, restaurants, bars, hotels, recreation, civic uses, and housing to create economic and social vitality. So I guess vitality is the cousin of vibrancy. Nothing wrong with compatible uses, but again, we have to question what that really means and whether or not it should be part of a regulatory code that applies to all residents of an extremely diverse community. Emphasizing the need to serve the adjacent local neighborhood as well as greater Bozeman area. Okay, this is great. The broader question here is how is that best achieved? Is making, for example, downtown Bozeman an area that has the density of a large major urban area really the best way to have an urban area that is accessible to people who live in an otherwise suburban, exurban, or rural county and state? Maximizing land use efficiency by encouraging shared parking. The question here is, what is efficiency in land use and how does it balance against other goals? I'll get more into that in a couple of minutes, but it relates to this idea of sustainability. So how do we translate what these goals really mean? And in my experience, when I hear statements or proclamations like what I just read out in the UDC goals, what really pops into my mind is the following. One of the implicit goals is forcing density regardless of whether or not it makes economic or environmental sense. To density advocates and urban planners, density is a panacea that will fix all society's problems. It is unambiguously desirable and should be promoted above all other patterns of land use development. Unfortunately, if you dig into the literature, and often the literature is outside of planning because planning has somewhat of a cult-like mentality to it, unfortunately, what you find is that, yeah, there are certain areas where some level of density makes sense, but by and large, the situation is ambiguous at best, if not suggesting that lower densities are in fact desirable in an economic, environmental, as well as social capacity. And that if we were to have a realistic view of land use, we have to contemplate that. Next premise is forcing density regardless of whether or not people want to live in it. I will get more into this in a minute. However, the issue with forcing density is that consistently in the United States, as well as almost everywhere around the world, doesn't matter if it's a developing or developed country, doesn't matter the culture, the background of the people, the climate, as people climb the economic ladder, they want to live in a lower density, they want a little bit more space. Doesn't mean everybody's living on 5-acre lots, but they want a certain standard of living, and packing people into high density living conditions is not desirable. It's also, frankly, very antithetical to other features of being human. I'll get into that later in the talk, but the idea that you're going to force people into density really is not something that's in their self-interest. It may be in the interest of real estate developers. It may be in the interest of ideologues who think planning, again, is a panacea and is unambiguously desirable, but it's not in most people's interests. Another implicit goal is raising the price of housing and giving large institutional investors a significant advantage. So research consistently notes that when you have urban containment, which is an implicit feature of these plans, you create urban growth boundaries or you raise densities, the prospective value of developable land goes up because supply is reduced. Also, it advantages real estate investors because they'll buy land adjacent to the urban growth boundary that has yet to be incorporated, and they will buy that land at a very low price and then sell it at a very high price. This drives the cost of real estate up. It creates highly speculative markets. It also privileges large investors and builders over smaller operations. Another feature of this is demonstrating an unsubstantiated opposition to single-family housing, cars, yards, and economic and social mobility. It is very obvious when you look at this type of planning that there is an implicit hatred of cars, of single-family housing, of lower density development. Even if the people promoting these plans, ironically, all have cars, they all live in their own version of vibrant single-family neighborhoods, they want to prevent other people from having it, and they view these things as undesirable for most people to have. It is elitist, it is arrogant, and it's also out of touch with the economic and social reality. However, this unfortunate and highly irrational bias is interjected into a lot of land use policy, and it's clearly evident here in the UDC. Another consideration here is entrenching a questionable bureaucracy, that is, planning departments, not-for-profits that deal with affordable housing and so forth, at massive public expense. So I'm certainly in favor of good planning. I'm certainly in favor of a robust and efficient government. I do not mind paying taxes to support such, and nor should any reasonable person. However, when you have agencies that are entrepreneurial, one of the things they do is they create regulations to expand themselves, to increase their costs. So when we look at the UDC, it's 528 pages. That's a substantial expense to write. It's also a substantial expense to implement, revise, and regulate. All that requires more people. It requires a larger bureaucracy. And as bureaucracies get larger, the leadership generally demands more money, more consultants, also more collaboration with not-for-profits that support their goals. Again, no one is opposed to good planning, but that does have to be contemplated. The final point about UDC goals and what they really mean is this idea of promoting vague concepts. As I said before, vibrancy. I've been studying this stuff for the better part of 20 years. I've never found out exactly what vibrant is. Does it mean that the community vibrates at a certain frequency? For example, I hear Taos, New Mexico has a certain hum to it that certain people can move here. Does it have an official frequency like 425 hertz? I don't know. This idea of vibrancy or sense of place are vague, poorly developed ideas that are thrown in that make certain people feel good about themselves, but they really aren't an artifact of objective or solid public policy. A very good critique of vibrancy, if you're interested, was written by an author, Thomas Frank. His most famous book is What's the Matter with Kansas? In another book he wrote called Rendezvous with Oblivion, he has an entire chapter where he discusses vibrancy. And his major point, and keep in mind, Frank is a very liberal individual. This isn't a conservative critique, is vibrancy is intended to cover up the elitism and gentrification of the ruling class against other elements in the community. And that when you have, let's say, a working class town that becomes vibrant, what it really means is that a good chunk of the population is actually being excluded from civic dialogue. Another one is sustainability. So sustainability as a concept is actually a really good idea. The predominantly accepted definition is meeting the needs of today without impinging upon the needs of the future, developed by the UN's Brundtland Commission in 1987. Sustainability has components, and it's not a perfectly objective metric. The major components of sustainability are economic, social, and environmental sustainability. And the reality of it is that you cannot have a sustainable system by just focusing on one variable. And Bozeman highlights this problem. So when we look at environmental sustainability, a lot of these land use restrictions and the forcing of density is often justified using environmental rhetoric. The problem with this is that everything has an environmental impact, regardless of whether or not it's material. And you can really regulate something to death, which is what has happened with housing. Also, when we look at Bozeman, we have to question, is it environmentally sustainable? Okay, there's some debate there, but the big ones is it economically and socially sustainable? In 2025, the median house price in Bozeman is pushing $1 million. The median condo price is pushing $500,000 or $600,000. That certainly is not economically sustainable, and it isn't socially sustainable. One of the more disturbing things that I see in Bozeman, as well as Montana and the United States at large, is the idea that my son will not be able to afford the same standard of living that I have. And that the young people growing up in Bozeman, regardless of what they aspire to do, will not likely be able to afford to live in Bozeman, let alone at the same standard of living that their parents did. So despite all of the rhetoric of these planning schemes promoting sustainability, they really accomplish the opposite. And in fact, their environmental impact is likely negligible. Economically, they're disastrous, but also socially, they're disastrous. Unless you are rich, you really cannot afford Bozeman. Another concept is livability. So in the mind of a planner, a livable community is one where you don't need a car and you live in a 200 square foot room with a bathroom down the hall or a studio apartment. When we look at other countries that are high density, this is not livable. And the evidence for it is actually very clear. Higher density countries, the birth rate drops. People stop having kids. Also, more expensive countries, the birth rate drops. People stop having kids. That means they can't afford to live. That's happening here in the United States. So if you want a very good example of this, Japan in the 1980s is an excellent case. High density housing, but more importantly, unaffordable housing. Japanese stop having kids and now their population is collapsing. Another one is walkability. No one is against having pedestrian traffic or bicycle traffic. I myself am a pretty avid cyclist and hiker, but the idea that you're going to force people to walk more is again, very arbitrary. And the big one here is sprawl. Sprawl, according to the ideology of urban planners and density advocates, generally is lower density development that develops new land. But the reality is sprawl is a very arbitrary concept. And as with all religious-like belief systems, those who promote density can never really get enough of it. They can never seek any type of balance, either in terms of reconciling the desire for density over other considerations. And ultimately, the idea of sprawl really highlights the irrationality of this way of thinking. I'll get more into this in a little bit. You cannot have good public policy based upon a vague assumption like we're limiting sprawl. You have to have identifiable metrics that can be translated into tangible policies that can then be implemented, but also account for the complexity of reality. So this is what the real goals of the UDC are. So a little bit more on this idea of sprawl to highlight this, because this is an important one. Yeah, and sprawl is very arbitrary. Much like vibrancy, we really don't know what it is. Again, if you're going to have an objective understanding of development and how to properly plan, you have to simply acknowledge there are some areas that will be higher density. There will be other areas that will be slightly lower, middle density, low density, and so forth. So to highlight this point, let's look at some satellite images of various development patterns and contemplate this one specific issue. And again, this can be applied to the other features of the UDC goals. So this first image, and the scale on all these is 50 meters for consistency's sake, is downtown Hong Kong. So pretty unambiguously, this is a high density urban area. It's one of the densest areas in the world. You see high rise residential buildings, you see very little open space. People are packed in here. Interestingly, Hong Kong has plenty of buildable land, but the area that is permitted to be built on is relatively limited and tightly controlled by the Chinese authorities. So sprawl can occur even in Hong Kong, but they force people into absolutely inhuman densities. Not a place most people want to live. Let's compare Hong Kong to Upper Manhattan. Again, same scale here. So Upper Manhattan, you got a little bit more in terms of parks. In terms of footprint of density, it's still about the same as Hong Kong, but the buildings are lower. They likely don't exceed 4 or 5 stories. So is Upper Manhattan sprawling? It's lower density than Hong Kong. In this area, you probably have a population density of 15 or 20,000 people per square mile. In Hong Kong, you have a population density of probably 30 to 50,000 people per square mile, depending upon the area. Moving along, Queens. So getting out to the western portion of Long Island, New York. In this area, you see predominantly single family housing on small city lots. The lots are likely 50 to 70 feet by 30 feet. You know, there's a little bit of yard for people, but not much. However, when you look at the density here, it's still probably 5 to 7,000 people per square mile, if not more. Is this sprawl? Moving along to more central Long Island, so we're going out the Long Island Expressway. We go to Brentwood in Suffolk County. This is more lower density urban single family neighborhoods like Levittown. These houses are on lots that are likely 50 to 70 feet by 100 feet. Even in this area, the density is probably 3 to 5,000 units per square mile. Is this sprawl? Fitting in people into relatively compact development that's still relatively efficient to provide them with public services. Moving out further, so more out towards Montauk Point in Long Island, here you have houses, still relatively modest middle-class houses, on large suburban lots, probably a half to 3/4 of an acre. Even in this, you're still getting into the thousands of people per square mile. Is this sprawl? Or shooting over Long Island Sound to Connecticut, this is a very dispersed development pattern with houses likely on at least half-acre lots, if not acreage lots, interspersed with rural areas. And even at this density, you're probably still looking at 2,000 people per square mile. Is this sprawl? And the next question to ask yourself is, what do most people want to live in? Do they want to live in Hong Kong? Do they prefer a dense single family neighborhood, a suburban single family neighborhood, a rural single family neighborhood? You can't really dictate preference. And unfortunately, what this ideology of density advocacy as well as urban planning wants to do is it creates narratives to justify packing people into Hong Kong rather than simply acknowledging that all of these different development patterns have their place and that the real job of the urban planner as well as policymaker is to figure out how to make these work in a transparent way so that people can have options and choices. So, what should the real goals of UDC be? Rather than forcing density, planning should realistically respond to the type of infrastructure people want, but also the type of infrastructure that's economically and socially feasible. Most people, 80%, and this is a consistent statistic in the US, and it's also pretty consistent in other developed countries, prefer single family housing. The idea that you're going to have a population that's 50% or 80% renters living in multifamily units contradicts what most people find desirable. Also, most people do not find high density housing desirable. It's one thing to be a young single person or college student in your early 20s and have an apartment, makes getting home from the bar late at night, a little bit easier, but once you get a little bit older and want some more space, the single family house in suburbia or the rural property where you can have your projects is generally a desirable thing. Also, as I said before, density, when you look at birth rates, very consistently results in lower birth rates because it becomes expensive and frankly very problematic for people to have families and keep society going. Also, when we look at transit, I am all for public transit. I think there are people that need help that cannot drive. I think that buses have a place. I also think rideshare has a place. However, the reality of the modern world is that the private automobile makes economic and social sense, but also environmental sense. So here are the statistics. The light blue bar here is US highway passenger miles. As you can see, cars, so light duty vehicles, are the overwhelming majority of trips. Buses, rail, light rail, so forth, are only a very minor part of US transportation. Now, a lot of the planners will say, well, what about Europe? Europe is a vibrant, dense place. It's fantastic. Well, when we look at the European statistics, so this is Eurostat transportation by mode data for the European Union for 2023, we find that driving in most of the EU is around 85%. So the trips might be less, the cars might be smaller, but people are still driving. The reality of the economics of something like rail is it's a 19th century technology. Also, things like buses are what in economics is known as substandard goods. Once people have money to take cars, they drive. Also, when we look at financing rail, but even bus systems, invariably they operate at massive public subsidy, especially rail. So Seattle's light rail, for example, runs in the billions of dollars. It is not exactly something that is self-supporting and never will be. It may have its place here or there, but you really can't rely upon it to have a modern economy. So getting back to that irrationality about cars, density advocates, rather than attempting to reduce traffic, keep traffic flowing, but also advocating for smaller, more fuel efficient and compact cars, indulge either in an anti-car mentality or other fantasies such as assuming that EVs will replace conventional cars, which technically that is completely infeasible at this point in time. So again, any realistic planning scheme has to contemplate this. Cars aren't going away. You either learn to live with them or you create massive, massive problems by not addressing this issue. Some other things to contemplate, and just as resources to you. Again, urban containment does not work. The data is very clear. So admittedly, Reason is a libertarian think tank. They have an agenda, but there's plenty of academic research out there that notes the economics of urban containment. Also, some other discussions that are useful. A good book is The Coming Age of Neo-Feudalism by Joel Kotkin. Joel is a traditional Democrat, and he's been very critical of this density agenda in Southern California. And one of the features of this mindset, and it's something that a lot of people don't understand or discuss, is what the elitism really amounts to is a type of feudal or neo-feudal mentality. It's the idea that a small elite group of people, either by virtue of being elected or by virtue of their money, can dictate how everyone else lives, and that people don't have the right to determine themselves. And I think that this idea should offend, obviously, libertarians and conservatives, but it should also offend liberals, leftists, and socialists as well, because essentially what the mentality states is that people don't matter and that society exists to serve a few. This is very contradictory to modernity and the goals of the Enlightenment that have made modern progress what it is. Joel Kotkin has a website, newgeography.com. It's worth checking out. Some planning related sites. So Randall O'Toole, who's formerly at the Cato Institute and is a thoroughly good guy who does very objective analyses of land use as well as transportation issues, has a website, ti.org/anti-planner, where he critiques various aspects of planning. And another website that has tons of data is run by a gentleman by the name of Wendell Cox's demographia.com. And he looks at things like housing affordability and its relationship to land use.